Hi, I'm Rebecca Mander, and you are listening to the Bounce Mindset podcast. During my time as a busy mum and managing director in 2007, I managed significant personal loss and professional challenges as the only woman on the board. I believe we always have a choice, and that a resilient and what I call a bounce mindset is possible for anyone to develop. Join me as we meet some incredible guests, sharing their bounce forward stories, including my own in episode 1. I'm so excited to have you here, and also would like to thank Grow Radio Production and Stephen Bedell for Dragonfly, my very own theme tune. Enjoy. Hi, and welcome back to the Bounce Mindset podcast with Tier Blundell. In our last episode, we heard the incredible story from Tier of how he rose from being an uneducated, excluded child from school to becoming Oxford's first ever student accepted from a pupil referral unit, with a real love of learning and a plan to change the narrative around exclusion in schools. In this series, we learn how Tier did just that and how he fought his internal imposter phenomenon to be the very best he could be. Tier shares how he's now influencing teachers and institutions to, in their own words, do better. And this is a wonderful episode that encapsulates Tier's mission moving forward. Previously, with Tier Blundell in episode 4.
It wouldn't take long for an argument to happen or something, and then they'd just switch, and then they'd start calling me a backy. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, you never really know who your friend is. Because I think it's important to say that, for me, when I was called that, it hit me in a very unique way that I couldn't quite articulate or understand, because I was mixed race, but I kind of virulently didn't want to identify as Pakistani. I was hoping for that kind of recognition and that kind of, because I'd never got that in school. I wasn't really getting that. And I certainly wasn't getting it at home, and I definitely wasn't getting it in my community. You're not welcome back in the summer. And then it was the conversation around there's this other school and so on. And I remember that it just felt like the air from me and my mum was like just defeat. It was just defeat. We were just being led to the gallows, really. That was, there was no opposition, and that was amazing. It was amazing because I was accepted. I was included. It's the first educational institution that wanted me.
And how old were you?
24
years.
So I think when you look at that, actually it was the way that I was treated, it was the fact that I was given an opportunity and that somebody believed in me. So I thought, I want to change the narrative, change the conversation on that. So that was when I concocted the plan, and I pushed through, and I had to work really hard to get there, and I got to Oxford, and now I'm able to kind of talk about this issue.
Meantime, you did a master's at St Andrews, is it?
Yeah.
And then got to Oxford. And when I'm working with people, and people think that imposter phenomenon is just a female or woman thing, it's actually not. And quite often when I work with some men, they have imposter phenomenon because they might have come from a state school background. They might have a very strong regional accent. And then they go to they work really hard, as did you, and they get to universities such as the ones you're describing. And that imposter phenomenon is exacerbated because when they look around them, they don't see a lot of people like they are and that sound like they do. People are going on skiing holidays at half term and they've come from a privately educated background. What was that like for you, coming from a pupil referral unit going into these institutions?
Yeah, well, initially it was quite embarrassing because, I did I call it a social experiment, but in my first year at Warwick, I decided to live in halls and kind of get that experience. Mm-hmm. Of course, most people were 18 and they'd just done A-levels, and some of them had come from boarding schools and other such kind of, prestigious schools. And I just couldn't relate to what they were talking about. But then there was challenges because they developed skills of kind of revision and things like that. I just didn't have all those. But what I did have was a lot of other skills, and I was kind of a little bit more self-confident. I was happy to talk and engage in seminars. There was a really important moment when I got the reading list for one of my modules about a month before I was due to go to Warwick. And it was Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? And I started reading it and I thought, there's no way, I didn't understand it. I thought, there's no way. I've clearly bitten off more than I can chew here. And I remember I spoke to my cousin about it, and he said, Tier, some people spend hundreds of thousands of pounds spent sending their children to private schools to get them to Warwick. I think you should at least give it a go. And that kind of, I thought, wow, I didn't even realize that. I didn't even realize that's how much people spent on their education. And I thought, well, in that case, if that's how much this opportunity is worth, I better give it a go. And the irony is that became my specialty. I became specialized in enlightenment and Immanuel Kant, and more so Rousseau. And that was what I did my master's in. My master's was in intellectual history, which is the history of ideas. And we looked at Kant. I've written about Kant and those kind of thinkers. And that became my specialty. So it just goes to show that I had this imposter syndrome where I thought, there's no way I can, these people are way too smart for me. And I was nervous. I mean, obviously I'd fought many fights, I've over 30 full contact fights, and I would get nervous, before I'd go in. And I was nervous going to seminars, very nervous. And I would be really worried to speak. I'd almost have like a speech impediment. I wanted to engage, but I just felt like there's no way I can engage with these people around me that are super smart. And, they've done all these Duke of Edinburgh awards and model UNs and everything else that someone at Warwick has probably typically done that I haven't. And I thought, how am I going to compete? But gradually, over time, I realized that I could. And if anything, I was leading the seminars. So over time, that helped. But I think being surrounded by St Andrews was very challenging because of the wealth disparity. I didn't really have much money in St Andrews at all. I've never had any funding for any of my education other than just the state funding, which is next to nothing. It's a master's, and again, nothing at PhD. And that was a real challenge for me, being unable to, do the things that other people did and being worried about working and so on. So that was a real challenge. But yeah, imposter syndrome in academia is real. I've often been surprised at some of the people that have got it. And you're right, I think a lot of those have been women. I think for me, it really hit me on the nose. I mean, my first essay was so, I was called in by my tutor who said, you submitted a draft copy. But it wasn't a draft copy. It's just I didn't understand grammar because I'd never learnt it. So I had to go back and do these kind of things and relearn things whilst at university. So at St Andrews, that was when because the level there was so high, I got a personal tutor who helped me out, and I would meet with her and she'd take me through grammar, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. I've just got a first from Warwick and I'm still learning things about punctuation, so which doesn't help. And then at Oxford, I had an assessment for neurodiversity, and they said you've got learning difficulties, which is not the thing you want to hear when you're about to go to Oxford University. So again, these other little things come up and challenge my way of thinking and challenge, make me feel like, oh, it's not going to work out here. I've bitten off more than I can chew.
Yeah,
and I think that happens repeatedly, even when I get opportunities like this. And I wonder how far that's still connected to that young boy who was rejected by his family, was excluded, was put in this room and left all day. And I still think that boy is still present in those moments.
Absolutely. It's incredible that you've worked this all out for yourself. And it is that little boy and those messages, the messages we receive when we're young, stay with us, and they're very hard to remove. I think when we can recognize it's imposter phenomenon for what it is and think, I know where you come from. You come from that experience I had in that room with that hideous clock on the wall. That's where you come from. And that's gone now. I don't need to listen to that anymore. I think that's the moment really where you can try and overcome that imposter phenomenon. But it's always there. And I know, from when we've talked before, that you're still on that journey. And you are, with the lessons that you've learned and how your experience has shaped your views on what academic success is and what education is, you found it excluded from school.
Yeah. So my initial thoughts around this was that I wanted to create a network of people that have been excluded from school or excluded from education in some way, shape, or form, because I think it does take different forms for different people. And it certainly has through time. So, some of the people that have joined the network that have experience of school exclusion have this from the 50s, the 60s, and it takes different forms, and people see themselves in it in different ways, even from grammar schools and so on. But the effects are often the same. They often lead to what you're describing around imposter syndrome and that kind of not putting oneself forward to do things and sort of sitting in the back, in the back and not living up to one's potential because it's been damaged by somebody. And like when I was at school, a teacher said to me, "You'll never amount to anything." And there's so many examples of that. People being told that, very successful people now that have been told that, oh, you'll just work in a factory or you'll be a good secretary, very damaging things that are a message that stay with people throughout their life. And then you hear them, even if you're close with these people, you can hear them repeating it and you can see it in the opportunities they don't take or the visions that they don't think that they can, they don't envision for themselves. And getting that lived experience from so many different people, including even educators who have regret over some of the things that they did around excluding young people, but getting that lived experience that's zoomed out a bit as well, that's gone through life. People have said to me, yeah, I've only just started doing my degree or my PhD now, and I'm in my 60s, I'm in my 70s. And, you have to ask the question, what could life have been if we hadn't have had these awful experiences at school, if we hadn't been written off at school? So I think it's really important that we get those voices and we get the breadth of how it affects people through life, not just statistics, not just kind of, this is how much it costs the state and so on and so forth, but a little bit more and make it as human as possible. I think that's my mission. I want to make this as human as possible and really kind of, because, when I was in higher education, at universities, they don't understand this because they don't see people excluded from school. So they do things that help Black and minority ethnic, women, refugees, so on and so forth. But people excluded from school, I mean, probably fit these kind of other subcategories anyway, but have like real deep challenges, particularly at home and in their communities, and obviously in their own mental health and so on. But they're not recognized. So when you say, look, I was excluded from school, some individual professor might go, oh, right, okay, well, I'm going to help you. And that's fantastic. But the institution and the system don't get it. And they've got nothing in place to go, right, okay, you're a demographic of people that exist. And 10,000 a year are permanently excluded from school. Yes. And we know how much they make up in the prison system. So, you're clearly a recognized group. Let's help you to feel included and let's help you get a sense of belonging in this university. And what extra help do you need? There is none of that. And that's what I would really like to see. And so there are successful people, and there are some people who have had experience of exclusion that are working in universities and who are teachers and so on. And it's about bringing those voices together to kind of change the narrative on what it means when we decide to exclude a young person. What are we really doing? It's not simply moving them out of the class, making life easier for the students that are already there and yourself in the short term. But what are you really doing for the next 80 years for this person? So that was one of the predominant reasons I found excluded from school.
Yeah, and I read yesterday that nearly 1 in 10 pupils were suspended or excluded in 2022, 2023. And, so yes, you're right. It is, part of intersectionality. We need to think about, it is also the most marginalized children who are the most likely not to be in the classroom. As you said, I think on one of our chats, it's very rarely a child from a happy background and a happy childhood and that's well nourished and got everything they need to survive that is expelled. There's a certain, demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. And but that's not the predominant view still. Although we might take these things for granted, there is a lot of pushback by people that work in, even Department of Education or work with Department of Education that believe actually young people are just It's completely normal in human behavior for them to be not wanting to go to school, not wanting to do these things, and there'd be no issues. It's just purely their behavior. They're purely culpable. It's all on them, and they are 100% accountable. There's no kind of interest in going, well, I'm not saying they're not accountable, but let's zoom out a little bit
Yeah.
and think about where we're accountable. Where we're accountable as a society, and what have we got in place for young people, and what are we doing? Or where are we accountable in the way that we are running schools and running our classes and the teachers and the teacher training, and is it fit for purpose? And is there enough of it? And so on. And, as we've got 30 young minds in a class and their mental health at our fingertips, which you don't think you do because you're there to teach them maths, but I've got hundreds of emails that say, this teacher said this to me, and it's changed my life. So you do factually, what are you going to do about that? So that you can say you've done everything, so that when that child does then persist and continue in this behavior, you can honestly and honorably say, well, it's just the child's behavior. But where are we seeing what we can do? And I think that's what's missing at the moment.
So when you're facilitating change for pupils in school or outside of school, how do you get the message across to them that you're not unique? Because they might look at you and think, well, he did it, but not many people can do that. Tier's special because he had some grits and determination. How do you get that message across that the opportunities are there if you want them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a couple of elements to that, because I think you're absolutely right. I often do hear it said by staff or educators, and it's a sort of an underhand thing. I don't think they realize they're saying it, but they do. They say, well, obviously you're special. Obviously you're an outlier. And they say it in a praising way. But I think underneath that is still a low expectation for the kids that they, or most of the kids that they're in their charge. And that's what worries me. I think, and there's been lots of research on this, I speak about expectation a lot. So one example I'll give from my time at Warwick was that a professor of mine who I really liked, who helped me out immensely when my dad died, and he was in the intellectual history space. When I said to him, look, I'm interested in doing a master's, I've had a look at one, this university, what do you think? He simply said, no, I think you should apply to Cambridge. Now, what happened there was that he had an expectation for me. And then, in a sense, that meant I had something to lose. I had something to aim at and I had something to lose. So I wanted to work for that. It gave me that opportunity. And so I applied and I worked towards it. Now, the expectation for young people, particularly with that kind of view, well, you're an outlier, is that where's your expectation for them? If you expect great things from them, I think it can be that simple. If you just keep expecting that from them. I spoke to the head of an alternative provision trust that pays every year for every child to be able to do GCSEs, even though he knows most of them won't even turn up. But he does it because he is saying, I believe in you and I expect you to be able to do this, whether you do it or choose to do it or not. I think and this is what I say to teachers all the time. Think about your expectation. When they say, I want to do this, maybe expect a little bit more of them. That's an important thing, to challenge young people in this space. They respect challenge and they need to be challenged, but it's got to be a challenge that builds them up, not pushes them down. So I'm really passionate about making expectations for young people a bit broader.
Yeah, expecting and assuming that they can be the victor rather than the victim, and define, because it's the same as when you're coaching, you're asking a question because you're assuming they have the answer rather than telling them, what you think they should do. It's about assuming that they are the specialist in their life and that they can achieve whatever it is they decide is right for them and in their life.
And I think another thing about this as well is sense of time. I think that often, educators, parents especially, they get very stressed, especially when their child's out of school and the young person. It feels, and I go back to, when I said time was like so slow when I was young and in trouble and waiting for the phone to ring for me to be excluded and so on. It feels like I was in a pit that I could never get out of. This was just this dark reality and everything just felt so far off. When the next day felt so far off because I was going to be in a room all day, I could not conceive of a future. And I think one of the things I used to do was try and give myself, okay, I'm going to join the army or I'm going to do this. These really simple, achievable targets, simple, achievable roles that I might be able to do that are so unacademic. You'll always find they're always unacademic. Everything that someone in alternative vision wants to do is unacademic. And that gets built on by the expectations of teachers. They'll often say, oh, he likes to use his hands. Well, I like to use my hands. I like to box people. But that doesn't mean I want my whole job to be using my hands. I need to use my hands. It doesn't mean I want to use my hands all the time. I like to use my mind and think of abstract ideas and philosophy and politics and all the rest of it, and education and pedagogy. Just because I need to move sometimes doesn't mean that needs to define my whole life. So it's about thinking a little bit more about what young people can do, and letting them try it as well, letting them try it out and letting them go and meet different people and have different experiences. So I think there's a lot there, but I think attitudes do need to change. And when I do speak to teachers, I do talk about that. I do talk about I talk about EDI for people who are excluded from school, and I use a lot of my own story to talk about how the dynamics there can really affect people. And so, when you speak to them, understand what's going on for them and so on, understand about their positions in the community as well. They might be really respected. So, when you demand things of them instantly, they might just not be in that place to be demanded. You could just ask them. And in my experience, when you ask them, I've never had one not do it. But when I see teachers demand, I've never seen any of them actually do it. So it's just real simple observations like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And you're using your experience and you're learning to go, and you're doing lots of public speaking and speaking in schools, and that's really exciting. What do you think the future holds for you now, Tier?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I'm really loving the project at the moment, and I'm really loving, speaking to conferences and, lots of really, sort of multi-academy trusts engage me to do work and training with them, which is really great. And the teachers are really receptive and, inspired to kind of, do better. This is what they say, which I'm always struck by. He's inspired me to do better. The session inspired me it reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. I think these things can be lost. I mean, I even had it in martial arts. When I was training all the time in training camp for fights, I forgot the reason why I wanted to be a fighter, because it was just awful. I was burnt out, overtrained, and so on. It's no different to teachers. They're in the same situation. They're completely burnt out. And then having those kind of real lived experience stories of young people that were trying hard, that struggled, that were beaten down, really catches that spirit that made them enter teaching in the first place. And so I think giving people tools to kind of hold that and access that and deepen connection and restore connection with young people as well in their classes just means that their job's easier, they enjoy their job more, as do the young people enjoy school more. So I'm really enjoying that. And I mean, I've been very fortunate to have, opportunities come up to continue speaking this message, on television and other mediums. So I would just like to grow Excluded from School into, we're not for profit at the moment, but it'd be really nice to grow it into a charity that does research and advocacy and continues to do teacher training, in a more sort of sustained way. That brings in people that have the lived experience, that are in the network, and empowers them as well, empowers them and brings them up and enables them to work for, better outcomes for our group. We are a group, and that's kind of something I do believe. We are a kind of disadvantaged minority group. I mean, the statistics are all very clear about that. Whether we think about it every day or not, where we are in life with our career, etc., and then there'll be an unconscious ways too, is a byproduct of the fact that we were excluded from school, and that single moment we became less advantaged because we would not be able to do as many GCSEs as needed to do A levels and so on and so forth. We are now backstep immediately from our peers without any assessment of our intellectual ability, only an assessment on our behavior. And I'm very passionate about saying that behavior and intelligence is not linked. I don't believe they're linked. And they're not linked in these cases at school. And regardless of even if they were, we should not make those assumptions, and we should not write off young people, because, I am an example of that, but there are many more. And I think we need to really have a look at that.
You are a brilliant example of it, Tia. I mean, some of the words you've used, I don't even know what they mean. Highly intelligent. And the things that you chose to study, you know, are so fascinating, and, you know, such depth and such an interest in learning and growing academically. It's just phenomenal given the experience that you went through at such a formative age. If you could go back to 11-year-old Tier and give him some advice, what would that be?
Well, it's funny that, because there's two things. There's the challenge of fate in a way, because so when I did my therapy, one of the things that we did was we did a timeline, and we write out a timeline of things that happened in my life, and we would either put a stone or a different colored rose on. And I really agonized over my exclusion. I really agonized over it. I mean, all common sense says put a stone by it. But in the end, I put a rose by it, because actually it's the privilege of my life to be able to speak up for people. So, you know, in that respect, for me, you know, you say go back and speak to me at 11 years old, you know, I worry about what that might change, you know. But, you know, if I was to go back, it would be around self-love, because I was so unloved. I mean, that's just reality. I was such an unloved 11-year-old boy, and I don't think anybody who is 11 should be unloved. It shouldn't be allowed, you know, and it isn't right, and it's a sign that something isn't right in the world. So I would kind of go back and kind of, you know, and give him some love and give him that kind of support that he needs to take him through what he's got coming up. And also, you know, the sad reality about that is that probably nothing would have changed, because he behaved wonderfully as pupil referral unit, but they still didn't send him back to mainstream school, so he gave up. So, you know, one conversation, is that enough to tackle, you know, a whole systemic problem? And that's where I'm at. You know, I go to schools and I talk to young people, and they invite me to mentor, and I've mentored young people in alternative provision. But the reason I'm setting up this organization and took the bold step to go full time with it is because that isn't enough. Speaking to that young person is great, and they will hold it, but then they've got so many other challenges, and then they're fighting a school system that wants to exclude them for something as simple as having a puff on a vape. Which, I'm sorry, in my view, I mean, I don't vape, and I don't think any of them should vape. But when your life is as stressful as you are in county lines, and you don't know where your dad is, and your mum's out most nights, and you don't know where she is, but she'll probably come back at some point, and you're at school in the daytime, and you don't know what you've got to do when you finish school, but you know you've got to do something because you owe someone money, and you've got, I'm sorry, a white middle class teacher hounding you in front of your friends who actually, you know, respect you, because you've had a puff on a vape because you're a bit stressed out. You know, that's what people are dealing with. That's what young people are dealing with. And people like that, and the guy I'm thinking of didn't come back. He didn't come back to school. And I don't know, you know, who knows where he is. And that's the kind of challenges that are faced. And I just want to do something in the way of changing whatever I can, and just getting people to think, so that there's a bit more lasting change, so that young people can actually have a chance. So if I did have that conversation with myself at 11, you know, someone needed to have a conversation with some of the headmasters and so on to say, get him back to mainstream. He'll thank you for it, and he'll show you he can do it, because that's what I would have done. That's where the conversation needed to be. This kid really means it when he says he wants to come back to mainstream school and do his best. He really wants it. So that's where some of the other conversations need to happen too.
Definitely. Well, I have absolutely no doubt that your story will continue to inspire and change the face of education and pupils everywhere. And I'm sure that you're impacting so many children just by hearing your story. And it's just been such an honor to share this moment with you, this hour that we've had together. I'm just so grateful to you for accepting my invitation to do a podcast. And I'm just so excited for what the future holds for you, Tier. And I really look forward to keeping in touch with you. And if anyone wants to get in touch with you, Tier, they can do that at excludedfromschool.com. We'll put the links in later, tierblundell.com. Band of Brothers, a charity that you're a trustee of, and LinkedIn for just a chat or a connection. So thank you so much, Tier. Honestly, it's been such a privilege. I'm really grateful to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's been a privilege, and I must say, you've inspired me, and you really touched me when you included me in your conference, and that gave me a lot of validation. So I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for setting up this podcast and having me as your first guest. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Bounce Mindset podcast. If you would like a coach in your pocket with free regular hints and tips to help you bounce forward in your career or personal life, then please feel free to go to the Bounce Mindset podcast show notes. And don't forget to leave a review for us. Thank you. Bye.